Welcome to Lecture 3 of Audio Video Production 100, AVP 100. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about ways to record sound. There are a number of well-developed techniques for recording audio. Choice of techniques depends on a number of factors: extraneous noises, sounds that you don't want to record that are present in the environment. What this basically means, what I'm talking about here, is that there are times where you need to have a microphone in a certain place. Sometimes you need to have a microphone. There are different kinds of microphones that record better in different situations. And there are different sources, like perhaps you're looking for voices, or you're looking for instruments that are acoustic, or maybe trying to record electrical instruments, or you're looking for natural sounds like birds chirping or ocean waves or wind blowing. In all of these situations, there are tried and true best practices, and you need to think about how you're going to go about them. The situation, the circumstances may limit you. Maybe you can't get a microphone as close as you would like to have it because there are obstacles, or just something is happening, or maybe you're making a film or a movie and you don't want people to see the microphones. And so those are situations where you also will have to decide what is the best way to record this. Cost is also a huge factor. And this is cost in terms of time or money, because a lot of situations will cost both. How much time do I have to set this up? And then if you need lots of rigging and lots of microphones, or very expensive microphones, you may not be able to afford that, so you have to figure out other techniques to make do with what you have. So there are a lot of factors that go into figuring these things out. When it comes right down to it, now I'm not talking about microphones per se. That's another video that I'll refer you guys to later on. But when we're talking about ways of recording sound, there are really 5 primary ways. Those primary ways are mono, or stereo, 2-track, multi-track, and MIDI recording. Now, mono kind of sounds, if you know your Latin roots or anything like that, mono means one microphone. Mono recording is as simple as it gets. It's very simple. One other big benefit of it is it's inexpensive. Pretty much anybody with a basic knowledge of audio recording can record audio. It's very good for one audio source. If you have one person singing, one guitar playing, it's usually, depending on the microphone you have, a pretty good way of recording things. Where it starts losing is that it is not so good for recording multiple sources, because what happens is you get what's called the proximity effect. Objects that are closer to the source will sound louder than objects that are far away. And so, or it could also be sources that are much louder will drown out. Let's say you have a flute and then you have a trumpet and you're recording them with one microphone. Well, what's going to happen? That trumpet is going to drown out that flute, and you have no way of getting around that with just that one microphone. Now, the next one is stereo recording. And stereo recording it's also fairly simple. You just have 2 microphones. That's what stereo, that stands for 2 microphones. Now, normally when you think of stereo, you're thinking of your stereo in your living room or your headphones, and that's stereo listening. Stereo, or also called monitoring. But we're talking about stereo recording. And when you're talking about stereo recording, you're talking about just 2 and only 2 microphones. Remember this, because this may come up on a quiz at some point. We're talking about only 2 microphones when we're talking about stereo recording. We will be talking about 2-track recording in just a minute, but when we are saying stereo recording, it means 2 microphones and 2 microphones only. Now, benefit to stereo recording is that it is, again, fairly simple. You have 2 microphones, not that hard to set up, and it's also fairly inexpensive. You have, again, 2 microphones, depending on the kind that you get, not as expensive as some situations could be. And another advantage over mono is that it does better recreate what it is that we hear in the real world. We have a left ear, we have a right ear, and by having a left speaker and a right speaker, it simulates how things actually sound to us if it's done properly. However, you do have the same issues as mono recordings do because you have the same proximity effect. Objects that are much louder than other objects or objects that are closer will drown out possibly things that you don't want to have heard. All right. Now, a typical mono setup, let's say, or not mono setup, I'm sorry, but a stereo setup, typical stereo setup would be, let's say we have an orchestra. Hang on a second. I hit the wrong button. Let's say we have an orchestra. And this is just one instrument, two instruments, three instruments, four instruments, five instruments, what have you. We have other instruments up here. And we have a conductor down here. Well, when we have our mono recording, let's just say this is our mono microphone. Well, now that microphone is only going to be hearing this side better than this side, isn't it? So that's why mono isn't quite as good. So we can, by making a stereo recording with our second microphones, so we have one and two microphones, we do then have more or less equal coverage on both sides, and it sounds to us when we listen to it, this is our speakers, as if we had heard it in the real world. However, again, we run into, with only those two microphones, items that are closer are going to be picked up better than the items that are farther away. So it is better, it is simple, it's very inexpensive to set up, but it's not always the most effective way to record a large group. A small group, 2-3 instruments, probably can get away with it. Alright, the next one is 2-track recording. Now, 2-track recording is separate or is different than stereo recording in that it has one microphone for every source that you have mixed into one track. So one microphone for each audio source. So if you have 10 musicians on a stage, you can have 10 microphones. Now, this can be a much more complex setup, and it can be a much more expensive setup because obviously 10 microphones is much more expensive than having 2 microphones. Also, you need to have what's called a mixer, and a mixer mixes in the several tracks and allows you to make one microphone sound louder than another one. So going back to our situation of the flute versus a trumpet, we can turn the volume on the trumpet's microphone down and turn up the volume on the flute to be able to make them equal and match so that it'll be easier for our audience to hear. This does give you much better control than what mono or stereo recording did. However, you can get what's called spillage a little bit from microphone to microphone, so you still need to be careful about your setup. So let's say if you have that flute right in front of that trumpet still probably be loud enough you'll be hearing it on the flute's microphone. So you have to be careful. So that's another thing that you have to worry about, is that you need somebody with experience and skill to set these things up and to run it. And then another, you can look at this as an advantage or look at it as a disadvantage, but 2-track recording is a one and done. It's once you are done, you cannot go back and make changes. So that is another thing you have to be careful of, and you need somebody with that skill that is able on the fly to be able to mix the recording down to 2 tracks and make it sound correct and make it sound lively and really engage your audience with it. showing you an example of how this looks. Going back to, now this is 2-track. Oop, hang on. Okay, this is 2-track. So here is our orchestra again. Here's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So in this instance we have a microphone, 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 microphone. Everyone has their own microphone. Then over here is our skilled technician with a mixing board that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sliders. So each mic is run to this unit. And this also is where skill comes into play, because you have to know where to put the microphones for best pickup. You have to know how to run the cabling. But then during the production, it goes off to a 2-track recorder. We'll call that 2-track there. And then the person will raise or lower each level on as sometimes even as is playing, because let's say if they know that the flute is going to have a really important solo, so they'll pull down the other instruments and bring the flute up, but then the flute just is meant to be mixed with everybody else, maybe they'll pull that flute back down and bring up other instruments to sound better during the production performance or for the recording. So this is 2-track and more expensive and requires a good deal more skill. Now the next one is multi-track. And multi-track recording kind of, I guess, is in there, and that in this situation it's similar to 2-track in that you do have one microphone for each audio source. However, instead of only having 2 tracks, you have every source has its own track. Now, this is a very complex and expensive way of doing this kind of recording. You need very complex computers and you need a lot more storage. A 2-track recording, you can record at a fairly high professional level. 2-track recording on a 32 gig SD card, you can maybe get an hour to 2 hours worth of recording, maybe a little bit more. You start doing 16 tracks, you start doing 32 tracks, 50 tracks, you can see the storage goes up much higher. You also need fancier computers, more sophisticated computers and field equipment that are capable of bringing in that many channels of audio simultaneously. These are not off-the-shelf kind of pieces of equipment. They take a lot more work and a lot more skill. That being said, you have a lot more control over the final project, because since you are recording every source individually, that means that you can go back and redo individual tracks. So let's say the drums, a drummer misses their beat. You could actually go through and pull out to a certain extent that drum and then bring in, re-record new drums on top of it. Now, using the orchestra scenario, which I'll show you again here in a minute, it's a little more difficult. But if you do a multi-track studio recording, which we'll talk about in the next lecture, a multi-track studio recording definitely gives you that freedom to completely pull out whatever track you do or do not want. Also, though, even if you are talking about a live environment like an orchestra, you can gives you the freedom to record every instrument to their best levels, and then in post go through and try. Let's see if I bring the flutes up a little bit here, and then I'll bring the trumpets down a little bit there. Okay, now here I'm going to pull the violins up and keep the trumpets high. No, that's not working. Let's go back and redo it. It allows you the freedom to go back and make changes, which is extremely powerful. Yeah, I mean, I'll just real quickly go show you this again. This is multi-track. Again, here's our orchestra: 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Microphone, 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 microphone. This time we have a much more sophisticated computer. We got our monitors that are showing us what we're doing. These are our waveforms. Here are our slider controllers. Here's our expert. You can tell I'm a great artist. And again, each mic is run into here. Each mic is run in there, and you record it, and the engineer, their job is to make sure everything is at their best levels. They are not having to bring things up or down during the live production. But once it's all done, they go back to their computer and now they can keep working at it and working at it and working at it till it sounds better, till it sounds the way they want it. That's multi-track. So just as a refresher, multi-track as many microphones as you want or need, and each one has their own track. Two-track recording, again, as many microphones as you need, but everything gets mixed down to one track. So it's a one and done when you're done. It has to be done all at one time. And then you get stereo recording, which is only two microphones. Only two microphones. Sorry, wrong way. And then we got mono recording, which is the simplest, just one microphone pop down. So we got mono, we've got stereo, two-track, multi-track. Now there's one more that I've been saving for last because it's a little bit different than the other ones. That is MIDI. MIDI stands for Musical Instrument Digital Interface. MIDI. MIDI controllers are used all over the place. If you've ever played with a toy piano, you've played with a MIDI controller. MIDI controllers carries, the technical way description of it is MIDI carries event messages that specify types of sound, pitch, and speed of that sound. Plus it controls signals for volume, vibrato, excuse me, excuse me, audio panning, cues, and clock signals that set and synchronize tempo between multiple devices. What does that mean? What this means is that MIDI is a device that sends and records commands to a computer, telling it to play predetermined sounds in certain ways when the device, like an electronic keyboard, is played. So what a MIDI keyboard does is that when you hit the keys, or there are MIDI, all sorts of MIDI controllers. There are MIDI flutes, there are MIDI violins, but the most common is a keyboard. When you play the MIDI keyboard, each key is assigned to create a specific kind of sound at a specific kind of volume level. You play your song, like Mary Had a Little Lamb, it sounds like a piano. When you're done, one of the advantages of MIDI is that when you're done, you can go back. Let's say you play the tune for Mary Had a Little Lamb and you miss a note. With a MIDI recording, you can literally go back, since it's just computer commands that you're executing. You can literally go back and find that command in the code and change that one command. So if you drop a note, you can go back and change that note. If you decide, you know what, I don't want this to sound like a piano, I want this to sound like a violin, With the MIDI controller, all you gotta do is you can keep that same recording that you did, but now change it to sound like a violin. If you decide that, you know what, I'm playing that too slowly, well, you can speed that up, and unlike a normal audio recording, what's called an analog audio recording of the real world, a MIDI recording, since it's just a digital recording of commands, is that you can speed it up and pitch isn't going to be changed. Because normally, if you speed things up, they get really fast, or you slow it down, they get really low. With the MIDI controller, with MIDI recording, you can speed things up or slow things down, and no one would know the difference. Now, that being said, well, one more advantage I would say also the file sizes are much, much smaller. Because again, it's just a few kilobytes as opposed to a few gigabytes of file size, because it's just commands telling a computer to do other kinds of sounds. Disadvantages, though, are that these are electronically rendered sounds. So a lot of people feel that sounds made from MIDI controllers don't sound as natural as real world sounds. So a MIDI piano, people would say, because a piano is never the exact same, A note or B note, because the humidity is different, or the string's been hit. Every time the string gets hit, the string gets altered, so the piano is never going to sound the exact same every time, while a MIDI piano note would sound the exact same every time, barring whatever subtle changes, again, you would dictate in the code. So there's some people that feel that way. Also can be expensive for the good implements of this. Going back to how it's easier to change, the best way that I found to think about MIDI controlling is to, let's say I type in, go back to Mary had a little lamb. Well, right there, you see I misspelled lamb. Let me make this bigger so everybody can see here. I misspelled lamb. But so just like in word processing, I can go back here and now it says lamb. Well, MIDI is the same way. If I go back and play back what I just heard in the tune, I dropped a note, I can go back just to that one note and change it. And then also the way I like to think of this as well is with Word is that this is a Times Roman font, and if this is the MIDI equivalent, we'll call this the piano. But I can decide, you know what, I want this. Let's go with Arial Black. Well, now this is turning my piano sounds in a MIDI controller is the same thing as converting it to being a trumpet or a violin. It's the same commands. In this instance, it's the letters of the alphabet, but with MIDI, it's just commands for creating notes. As to what those notes sound like, that can be easily changed. So MIDI, a good way to think of MIDI recording is as almost word processing for these things. That's all I have for right now. The next lecture will be based on scenarios for recording in rooms for problems that you run into and types of microphones. Thank you very much.